The Transatlantic Slave Trade by Jeanie, Paige, Doegg. The transatlantic slave trade sold millions of black Africans as slaves to work for landowners across the ocean. The slave trade itself was brutal and inhumane. Europeans lacked a driving labor force. The answer to their problem was found in the form of slavery. The forced move of Africans from their homeland to the Americas dehumanized Africans with its exploitative characteristics. It changed the lives of Africans for years to come. Slavery itself changed lifestyle patterns and shifted total control through both trade and warfare. Nearly all of the pre-modern states worldwide depended upon slavery itself. This consisted of forceful exploitation and degradation for the greater good of others. The transatlantic slave trade greatly impacted Africa. Slaves were taken from all over the continent, including West Africa, West Central Africa, Eastern Africa, and Madagascar. The Islamic states of southwestern Asia and North Africa partook in slave trafficking. They imported slaves from Sudan and the Horn of Africa, as well as the East African coast. The heartland of transatlantic slavery was in the Caribbean islands, although enslavement of Africans stretched its way through the Spanish Empire, Brazil, Portuguese, and the English-speaking colonies of North America. Central Asia withheld the source of most slave dynasties. As the amount of indigenous people decreased, the Spanish and Portuguese found comfort in slavery. Labor became a slave's sole responsibility. During the colonization of the Americas, chattel slavery came to surface. Chattel slavery is a form of slavery where humans are viewed and treated as nothing more than goods or property. The slaves had zero rights, nor did they stand amongst one another as equal human beings. Instead, slaves were viewed as merely material objects at the mercy of their owners. Slaves were subjected beings with zero control over their body, their time, their labor, or even their own children. The Caribbean, as mentioned earlier, was the world center of sugar production. Sugar became the driving force behind the spread of slavery in Brazil and the West Indies. Sugar production expanded, which in return required more slaves in the workforce. Sadly, by 1725, slaves accounted for nearly 90% of the human population in Jamaica. The transatlantic slave trade was born for economical reasons rather than racist hate, as many believe. In fact, it laid the groundwork for capitalism itself. Europeans wished to prosper, however, this prosperity far exceeded selfishness. The colonial powers were willing to utilize their power, and the weaker people happened to be their target. They believed that those who were not of European descent were beneath them and could be used at their desire. Europeans secured their slaves from private African middlemen along the coast. Ironically, it was mainly African middlemen who captured the slaves. These men were oftentimes wealthy merchants or agents of African kingdoms seeking profits. Greed was a leading factor. Where there was money, there was greed. Where land was prosperous, slaves were increasing. The wealthiest of colonies were fueled by slave labor. The establishment of plantations that required hours of labor reeled in Africa and its peoples. They found themselves in the midst of the heartland of the transatlantic economy. European disease had conquered most of the indigenous people. What few were left were not good workers. Plantation owners turned to the lands of Africa for their needs. Africans were better experienced at work. Their expertise varied from agriculture to plantations and mines. They were used to the tropical climates and were not devastated by disease. The Portuguese and Dutch were involved in the slave trade in the early 17th century, whereas the French and English came into the picture in the later years. The 18th century saw the greatest amount of trafficked slaves. The French and Europeans ruled in numbers. The growing demand for slaves increased internal warfare throughout Africa. Likewise, the female slave market magnified. The slave trades dated back as early as the 13th century. Britain and the United States outlawed the slave trade in 1807 and 1808. It is estimated that over 35,000 transatlantic slave ships underwent voyages carrying more than 11 million Africans to the Americas. Upon leaving West Africa, traders would embark on the second portion of the triangular route between Europe, Africa, and the Americas, making up the transatlantic slave trade. The Middle Passage was to blame for many slaves' deaths. Slaves were forced onto ships of filthy upkeep. Many did not survive the voyage due to scurvy, smallpox, and other diseases. It took slightly under a month to reach Brazil. However, it took an estimated 2 months plus to reach North America. The slave trade made its greatest impact in the late 1700s. A third of the slaves sold were women. Sadly, children were victims to slavery as well. The loss of population and productive resources patched the way for European colonization. In the beginning, Europeans purchased slaves from Africans. As time elapsed and the market for slavery increased, wars were fought. The wars, however, also raged throughout the inner surface of Africa. Insecurities amongst communities ran rampant. Individuals felt that they had to protect themselves. This protection caused people to turn on one another. By partaking in acts of deceit, kidnapping, and multiple violent raids, slaves could be exchanged for weapons of protection. Survival in the New World required adaptation and acceptance. By the end of the slavery era, slaves entered the world of enslavement in ways never imagined. They were sold by friends and even family. They worked hours that most people today put in an entire week. There was no room for personal autonomy. Resistance to slavery deemed itself inevitable. It began at the very start of enslavement itself due to its merciless characteristics. There were numerous attempts to escape slavery in North America. It is estimated that 1,000 per year managed to actually escape. It is only human nature to desire freedom. The years between 1789 and 1801 held the largest amount of imports of African slaves. In 1807, Parliament in Britain outlawed participation in the slave trade. As of 1808, the importation of enslaved Africans into the United States was banned. The end of slavery, as they knew it, was near.